So, hi everyone. Thank you very much for joining us and for inviting us to sort of speak about motor accessibility. To quickly introduce ourselves, my name is Michael Nelson. I'm a technical specialist at the charity SpecialEffect, which means that I am part of the service delivery team. In particular, I work a lot with the controllers, the kind of gizmos and gadgets that you'll see helping to find new ones that might be helpful for people, adapt them in ways that might be beneficial to people, and generally support the occupational therapists with all things technical. We also give a lot of or we are sometimes invited to give feedback on video games and how to make the games more accessible directly. So that's me, Jacob.
Hi, I'm Jacob. I'm one of the occupational therapists working with Special Effect. My main role is working on the video game side of things. So we've got a team called the Loan Library team, and we specialize in helping individuals with a physical disability to access video games. So if they can't access a regular controller or mouse and keyboard, we look for alternative ways to help them gain access through means of specialized equipment, and software. And like Michael, I also chat to various games companies and developers to make recommendations on how to make games more accessible, which is going to be one of the highlights that we'll be focusing on in today's talk.
So, as mentioned, we are a charity, and we're best known for our work in helping people with physical conditions, disabilities, difficulties to get back into gaming. We do have some other projects, but we'll talk about the gaming. I appreciate that's probably hard to imagine. You've got a lovely photo of Arlo there, but we have got a little video which will do a much better job of explaining exactly what we do and how it works. So hopefully our little video will play.
With my disability, I'm limited to do things. I don't want to sound like a gameaholic, but it was one of the only things I could do for enjoyment.
Special Effect is an amazing charity who help people with disabilities to access gaming again.
Yes. I think it was my wife that told me about a charity that could help me to continue to play computer games. Yeah, just got in touch and it's been an amazing journey ever since.
Go away, bad guy.
Once Daddy got the equipment, that was her off, and her words were, "I'm now a gamer," and she's been playing it and having a time of her life.
I can't do a lot by myself, but I can play video games on my own, which gives me a good sense of independence and achievement.
It has been important for me to have the ongoing support from everyone at Special Effect because as I've grown up, they've helped me by adapting how I game.
No matter what MND throws at me, the guys at Special Effects come up with solutions to allow me to still play games. Now we've been doing some really amazing work with arcade controller games, and it's so liberating for me.
So I'll be honest, I didn't think Special Effects would be able to help me, but they tried different angles, different positions, and they made this brilliant system that I use today.
It's too good to be true. They can do this. It was like, oh, you got a new toy at Christmas. Gaming is fun, and that's the most important thing to me, is having fun.
If I hadn't had the chance to game and be involved with Special Effects, I wouldn't be in my games development and coding course at college because it opened my eyes to what I can actually do.
Games are a way to escape whatever is happening in general life and allow you to explore new places in a fun way.
It's changed my life, honestly.
In the world of gaming, anything is possible.
So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a better idea of what we do day to day. And thank you for the lovely reactions in the chat. We can't actually see you at the moment, so it's really nice to to have the feedback of love hearts and things. So thank you for that. And if you do have any questions, please just feel free to. Oh, bless you all. If you do have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and yeah, we'll get to them at the end. So yeah, so we help people to play video games. That's our bread and butter. That's what we do day in, day out, week in, week out, year after year. We're coming up to our 20th anniversary next year. So we've been around for a good long while, and we hope to be around for a long while yet. So as you sort of got the idea, Special Effect, we're founded to help people whose physical bodies, for some reason or another, is not really allowing them to do the thing that they love. And if you're a gamer, you know just how much a part of you playing games can be, and they can connect you with your friends, with your families, with communities. It can really help you to express yourself, especially in very creative games like Minecraft. It can really help you to express who you are. So we use adaptive technology. We have occupational therapists to get people playing and expressing themselves and just being the person they want to be to the best of their abilities. As you can probably guess, everyone we help is completely different, completely unique. That's why we have a team of medically trained specialists and tech guys like myself, along many other specialist individuals. And we will travel all over the UK, literally hop in a van, load it up with equipment, travel all over the UK to people's homes, to hospitals, to care homes, wherever people are. They can also visit us if they want to, and we'll work with them throughout their entire life to give them a completely modified setup so that at any point in their life, because we provide lifelong support. So it doesn't matter if you're 3 years old or 83 years old, we'll come out, we'll see, we'll help you. And as you can see from the video, there was Tiago there who's doing his gaming college, his gaming course in college. We've helped him since he was very, very young. So as someone ages, as the technology develops, as their condition maybe progresses or improves, as new games come out, new consoles come out, we are there every single step of the way, completely free of charge as well. So the assessments that we give, completely free. The advice and experience we share with developers is free. The equipment that we loan is free. At no point has anyone ever been charged for anything to do with Special Effect, and they never will. We are supported entirely by just very generous fundraisers such as yourselves, and just the goodwill and love of people in the world and the gaming community. So I don't know if you knew, this is some Xbox research, but there are approximately 3 billion gamers in the world. About 450 million of them have some kind of disability. So that does include sort of visual difficulties, Parkinson's, anything from very, very small to very, very extreme. But it is a significant amount of people who identify as having some kind of disability. So it can often sometimes be easily thought of as a fairly niche set of people, but it is a significant number of people. Like I said, we've been doing this for 20 years and we're easily going to be doing it for 20 more. So we can't help every person across the world individually. So a large part of what we do is we do go out and we see individuals, and then we take the lessons that we learn from that and the challenges that we sort of fix and overcome and what worked and what didn't, and we share it with video game developers and hardware developers. So people like Xbox with the Xbox Adaptive Controller. We worked with games like Sea of Thieves with Rare, so on and so forth. So we try to give back and feedback to the gaming community for people who want to. We don't force it on people. But you can ask us, and we'll, like we're doing today, sort of share what we know. So I just want to touch on what sort of is accessibility in game design, or what do we sort of see it as? And very simply, we believe it's about making small, reasonable adjustments to bridge the gap between what a player can maybe do physically, and what the game is kind of asking them to do. So we don't really encourage people to make these massive sweeping changes that completely change how the game plays. We're looking for small, reasonable things you can do to reduce the barriers that someone might be facing. So an example of that is something like the press start button at the beginning of games, right? It's a classic thing, a landing screen. It serves as a really nice entry point to the game. It's sort of got a bit of legacy history from the arcade scene, from when you press start, you put your coin and press start. But if someone, for instance, couldn't press the start button, they may have got really excited about playing Zelda, and then, they didn't realize that they would have to press the start button. They can't do it. So they're immediately hit with a barrier. So a small, reasonable adjustment we could make is to simply change that to be any button at all. It doesn't change how the game plays. We're not interacting with anything. It's just a small, reasonable adjustment. It's reasonable in terms of time. It's reasonable in terms of cost. It's reasonable in terms of the design and the theme and the feel of the game. That's the sort of thing that we're looking to do, just small little adjustments to make sure that people don't feel left out. And Jacob, as one of our OTs, is going to tell you a bit more about how you can do that.
Yeah, so when we talk about input devices, we're talking about any kind of physical controller that you're using to play games with, whether it's a gamepad, whether it's a mouse and keyboard. We like to be able to use as many of these devices as possible when it comes to playing games. So if obviously we've got consoles that are limited to their own controllers. However, you look at PC, you can plug in a variety of controllers that are compatible with a lot of games. What we like to see is these kind of accessible controllers. So in the top left, you've got the Xbox Adaptive Controller. In the bottom left, you've got the Hori Flex, which is for the Nintendo Switch. These are kind of a sort of bread and butter controllers that we use really frequently in our day-to-day work. So we rely on these really heavily because they're really good in being able to plug in accessible equipment like different style joysticks, different kinds of switches. And if these controllers are compatible with the game, that means that millions of other people can then play the games using their own customized setups that we can help with doing. So it's always good to, whenever you're making a game, just think about maybe trying out these games with these kind of controllers to kind of just see what it's like to use one in the first place. But and just give you an idea of how important these controls can be for such a wide range of people. And the way that we work as well is that we often tweak setups as people might have progressive conditions, or they might have a game that comes out that has more controls than they currently have. So we offer a lifelong service that we can go back to the person. If we've seen them in the past, we can see them again in the future and just adjust their setup due to their circumstances changing, whatever that might be. So this example of somebody using a smaller joystick with their one hand and a switch by their foot, and then maybe they increase in their movement, then maybe they don't necessarily need that. So then we can move to another setup instead. So we can keep on adjusting and tweaking so that these people can continue playing games for as long as they're comfortably able to. And that's the main thing as well, is how comfortable they play in these games. Because despite my title as an occupational therapist, it's not necessarily therapy we're setting out to achieve. We're here to make gaming inclusive, fun, and socially enjoyable. And this is an example of someone that we've seen a couple of years ago now. So this is Suzanne, and you can kind of see every single circular yellow circle there is a switch or bit of joystick that we've managed to position by Suzanne. So it's a quite complex setup, but she's still comfortable in using this. But this will allow her to play a wide range of games. I think she's got access to, it's like 6 or 7 switches, and also both joysticks as well. So if as much access we can give to the person as independently as possible is our goal. We want to be able to give them as much access to these games as we possibly can. So with input interactions, this is more about how you're interacting with a button. So for example, is it going to be a single tap to access it? Is it going to be a hold? Is there like a set hold time for it? Are you going to repeatedly tap to continue using it? So it's these little differences that can make all the difference with these games. So for example, in the original God of War, you have the option to repeatedly mash the circle button in order to proceed past one of these kind of, quick time events. It also gives you the option to change that to a hold instead, because I don't know about you, but I do think anybody, you don't need to have a physical disability to find that repeatedly mashing a button over and over again can be really physically taxing. And for somebody who does have a physical disability, that can be a huge roadblock. And if there's no way to get around it, then how else are people going to be progressing through these games, which are meant to be really fun and exciting for them? So an example we have here is someone we saw a few years ago called Faye. So she has quad cerebral palsy and she's got a large movement, particularly in her left hand. So we set her up that because she can use one side of the PS4 controller to begin with using her right hand, but she found the left side difficult, we decided to help her with the left side and add a couple of switches to accommodate for that. But one of the main things that she was playing was Shadow of the Tomb Raider, which has got a really great wealth of accessibility settings. And right up the get-go, as soon as you're playing as Lara and you have control of her, you immediately have to repeatedly tap a button to break free from a rock that you're trapped under. However, straight away, you can go into the pause menu, you can change this to a hold instead. And that just makes all the difference. And not just that as well, but if it also has a what we call the toggle aim as well. So in games you have to hold down a button to accelerate or to aim down sights. You could maybe think about making that into a single tap instead, because if you're having to hold down a button and then press the fire button and then use your thumb on the joystick to move the camera to aim with, and then maybe use your other thumb to move the character, those kind of simultaneous actions can be incredibly difficult for a lot of people. So trying to have a think about reducing the amount of simultaneous inputs that you can do would be to sort of change how you interact with the buttons. So immediately, once you change a hold action to a toggle instead, where you press it and it will aim automatically for you, then you press it again to come out of it. That means that that person doesn't necessarily now have to hold down the button and then fire. They can press the button to aim and then just press the fire button as much as they need to. So it's all about thinking, how can we make these inputs easier for a lot of these people? So action mapping, we're talking about remapping. So we're talking about being able to move the controls around, whether it's kind of at a system level on the console where you've got kind of like a flat control scheme for all your games, or whether it's going to be individual layout that you can do within the game itself. So ideally, we like to look at being able to remap the entire controller, not just the buttons, but also the joysticks as well, because you find in some games, you can actually remap the individual joystick directions rather than kind of having a swap sticks option where you can swap the left stick with the right stick. And what we call it the southpaw mode that you find in a lot of first-person shooter games. So being able to allow the players to choose where the buttons are going to be on any control scheme is incredibly handy, because there might be some buttons that may be quite difficult to reach, like for example some of the back buttons on the gamepad. If you can kind of remap them to be in the front, then that can work for so many people. But it's also not just for gameplay as well. You can also think about how these actions are remapped in menus too, because you'll find in a lot of games now you can use the bumper buttons to change between different submenus basically. But I think I'm jumping ahead actually with the slide there. But this is a great example of being able to simplify really complex actions. So this is from Spider-Man Miles Morales, and you can kind of see on the right side there's loads of actions in there that require at least 2 or 3 buttons to press. What Insomniac ended up doing with this is that they still had the option to use these actions with these buttons. However, they've also given it so that you can assign a shortcut instead. So these buttons that you need to use 2 or 3 buttons to press can now be done by simply pressing the left D-pad or the right D-pad. And I think as well, you can remap those D-pad shortcuts to be whatever you need them to be, which is kind of like a step in a step. So it's like a really cool way of getting around these really complex actions, because people will still want to be able to, if they're able to, still want to be able to access these actions. But it just gives that secondary option for people who may not have the physical capability of doing that. So yeah, as I was saying about the menus as well, this is from the FIFA games. So again, we're talking about the sub menus that you're having to use, the bumper buttons to kind of navigate through. Maybe even sometimes the right stick that you need to navigate through some sub menus. What EAFC, previously known as FIFA, have done now is that they've been able to turn that off so that you can just kind of use the left stick to navigate everything. Because that's one of the things we look for when we're trying to help individuals is, can they access a joystick? If they can, that gives them access to moving a character and gives them access to menu navigation. So being able to fully navigate a menu is really critical, because how else are you going to get into the game if you can't access the menu to begin with? Because if somebody hasn't got access to the bumper buttons, then they're going to maybe have a difficult time just getting to the accessibility menu in the first place. So it's always good to think about, how am I getting to these settings to make these adjustments? And is it simply a case of using like a joystick to navigate through? Is it cursor control? Am I using, one button to select? So trying to keep it as sort of the fewest amount of buttons and fewest amount of inputs to navigate to that will just remove a lot of frustration for our players. And speaking of which, reducing the total amount of inputs is really, really critical. So many people that we see might only have access to a single joystick or a single button to play these games. And so what we typically find is that games that don't have as many buttons to play are considered pretty much accessible for a lot of people, because you don't need to press so many buttons to access them. So games like Sonic, games like Paw Patrol, which you pretty much need one joystick and one button through the most for most of the case, is really useful, because it just means that we can say to people who can only access a joystick and a button, we've got like a wealth of games that we can show you. There's even some games where you can just use joystick only. So for example, the Vampire Survivors game that came out a couple of years ago is a brilliant example where it auto shoots for you, and all you got to do is move your character around, and it's incredibly addictive as it is. I know that firsthand. But there's just so many games out there that you don't necessarily need to put in all these inputs for the sake of the inputs. You could think about even reducing the control scheme. So if you want to have a game that you want to use all the controls for, maybe if you can find a way to minimize that as another option. So I know there's a Ratchet and Clank game where all the traversal options are, you've got like 4 different ways of traversing, using like hover boots and swing shot and what have you. Insomniac created an option to merge all those to the circle button if you wanted. So you're kind of reducing from 4 buttons to a single button to do 4 different actions, all depending on what context you're using them in. And there are even some games out there that have really good control schemes with the button reduction. So FIFA has got the brilliant 1 and 2 button mode, so you don't need to use the entire control scheme for that. And we use that an awful lot in our line of work. Street Fighter has got, is it a modern control scheme that does a lot of these complex actions where you don't need to do really hard sequences in one go. You can just kind of press a couple of buttons and immediately you're doing these amazing attack schemes. This is a chap that we saw a few years ago called Leo. So he's got quad cerebral palsy and he finds that his left arm is weaker than his right. Main game he wants to play, Mario Kart. Another really popular one that we like to show people. Racing games in particular are really, really good, particularly as you, from a very sort of basic control scheme, if you have a joystick to steer left and right, and you've got 2 buttons for brake and accelerate, you've kind of got your racing game there. Mario Kart took it one step further, where it allows you to auto accelerate and to smart steer. So you can kind of see Leo there has got a joystick and he's got a single switch. So if he wants to use just a joystick, he can just whack on the auto accelerate and he can just focus on steering the car. If he feels like he wants to use switch another day, then he can just sort of hold that down, and then he can turn on the smart steering instead. So he's got these options as to how he's feeling on the day, as to whether he wants to use the switch, like much more simpler inputs that will steer the car automatically with the smart steering turned on, or he can steer it himself with the joystick, and then he can just have the auto accelerate turned on. And if you wanted to use joystick, it then has the option to use the item throw button with the Switch as well.
Yeah, and this is back over to me. So I mentioned at the beginning what we're looking for is small, reasonable adjustments. So you probably got the idea that there's so much control that a player can get simply by having the controller adjusted to them and having the way that the buttons interact sort of match and be congruous with their body movement. So we saw Suzanne earlier had a very high spinal injury, and she went from not being able to play anything at all with a standard controller to having 7 buttons and 2 joysticks, as Jacob said, which is the vast majority of games, simply because she had the right kind of buttons in the right places and they behaved in the right kind of way. So I've made a cheesy tier list because I feel are you really learning about games on the internet unless some stranger on the internet is telling you about talking you through a tier list? It just makes life simple. And one of the big things that feedback I've had from developers is how do I know if, you know, how much harder is pressing a button twice versus pressing a button once? Is a button hold better than pressing a button twice? You know, those kinds of questions. So I just want to talk you through this to help you build a bit of an understanding about what these adjustments actually mean when you're coding them and things into a game and when you're looking at your games for things. So I'll very quickly breeze through it. So in our S tier, super accessible, as Jacob mentioned, single button press. So if a great practice to do is sort of go through your games and have a look, is there any button that we've made maybe a hold or a double tap or a quick time event or whatever it might be, or a combination of buttons? And really what we're trying to do is move them up the tier list. By all means, have them be double tap or whatever by default, in the same way that in the Tomb Raider game, you mash the button because you got the rock on your leg, and like that's really thematic. We wouldn't want you to change that. However, it's about giving players the options so that if that's difficult for them and they get stuck doing that, you want them to have the option to be able to bypass that, because at the end of the day, mashing circle over and over again wasn't really the object of the game. The object of the game is to experience the story or play with your friends. So there's very few games where simply pressing the buttons is the main challenge. So in S tier, single button press, single mouse or joystick movement, and a single button. Basically all things single in the S tier. And then you'll notice we actually skip A entirely. And that's because the difference between having to hold a button down and simply pressing it is really quite significant. It's not a linear graph. Somebody with, say, cerebral palsy can have a relatively easy time pressing a button, but because they have these involuntary movements, holding their arm in one place can be very difficult. So if you do have a button hold in your game and it seems reasonable, it's not going to break the game, or it seems reasonable to have an option where that button hold can instead be a single press. So an example of this was when we worked on Sea of Thieves. You had this really cool, you'd hold the button to load a cannonball into the cannon. And it was really thematic because that's how long the animation took, and cannonball was obviously heavy, so it kind of had this like feeling of you lumbering this cannonball in. So it worked really well. But there was room there. There was room for an adjustment. So there's an option, we advise an option. So you can now open up the options menu in Sea of Thieves and turn that into a single button press, and you press it, the same animation will play out. You just don't have to hold the button anymore. So the player is not gaining an advantage in any way. It's just reducing the physical strain on that player. So similar thing with a double button press. So holding a button, pressing it twice, they're about the same. They're about the same. So if there's a way to make that into a single button press, that's a big jump. Similar jump again. So pressing two separate buttons at the same time, say for something in like Tekken or like a fighting game where you might do a grab or something, or the Spider-Man example Jacob gave earlier, is a really great example of, is there a way that we could reduce that down, either to a button hold or even better to a single button press, like in the Spider-Man example, because then you're jumping from the D tier all the way up to the S tier. So with a tiny adjustment of letting people sort of macro those buttons together, like the Spider-Man adjustment, your game is becoming significantly more accessible. So it's a really good sort of low-hanging fruit for a very small time investment you're able to make your game significantly more accessible. And you'll notice in E tier, two joysticks. So it's to sort of us able-bodied gamers, two joysticks can feel quite natural. We sort of grow up doing it, we learn how to do it. However, if you've ever sort of gotten someone who's never played games before in their life to try using a gamepad, actually using joysticks is quite confusing and physically demanding. You know, it's a bit like tapping your head and rubbing your belly at the same time. As gamers, we get used to it, but a lot of people with physical disabilities and all kinds of disabilities maybe have never played a game before because they weren't accessible enough, or they haven't played a game in a long time because of their injury. So they might not be used to two joysticks. And also, it's really hard to state just how difficult it is to do two joysticks at the same time along with a bunch of buttons. As you saw with Suzanne, she had one by her arm but another by her chin, which, you know, moving your chin, it's useful and she's able to play. But if there's any way at all to add, say, a single joystick mode, so that's something, again, we worked with the Sea of Thieves crew to implement a series of options that were reasonable that enabled a single joystick mode. Gears of War 5 also has a really nice single joystick mode. So if there's anything you can do, even if it's maybe a little slower than using two joysticks, give players the option to do that. It's by all, you can have two joysticks by default, that's completely fine, but we want to give players the options so that they're not getting left out. They're not feeling like our snails sort of falling between the gaps because we didn't sort of stop to think about them, you know? So one of the biggest adjustments you can make to your game is some form of single stick mode or something to alleviate the need for that second stick. And then finally, in the F tier, we're talking things like holding 3 or 4 buttons down at the same time, using two joysticks and multiple buttons and buttons and press and holds, which sounds a bit like when are we ever doing that? But in that two joysticks and multiple buttons at the same time is classic FPS gameplay because you're using left stick to move forward, right stick to aim down the sights, you're holding left trigger to aim down the sights, you're maybe jumping at the same time, and you're probably pulling the trigger to shoot at the same time. So when you actually think about how many buttons and different directions and things you're all doing at the same time, it's really sort of finger gymnastics that we're doing with these controllers. It's just that we've gotten used to it. So again, small, reasonable adjustments that can be made. So I just got this, like I said, cheesy tier list to help give you a sense of, you know, where do these things all sit in relation to each other. And then, of course, motion controls. We're talking about people with complex physical disabilities and spinal injuries. So that, you know, for obvious reasons that can be difficult as well. But I do want to stress, completely fine to have them as the default. We're really talking about giving options to the players. They can go into settings and find things that let them adjust the game to them so that they can enjoy the story of God of War and Tomb Raider and Mario Kart and, you know, whatever it is that they want to do. So in that same vein, just want to touch on the settings information. So I just said, you know, we've got all these cool settings in our game that we're thinking of. A huge part of that is you don't want to spend a lot of time making these amazing settings, but people either don't know they're there or they don't understand what they do. Similar to the menu thing. So we want to also advise on how you want to sort of display your information. So Ghost Recon from a few years back did this really, really well. So you can see on the left-hand side, we've got the name of the setting, whatever it might be. And then on the right, you get a short sentence that tells you exactly what this setting does. And then even better, they've got a little clip that actually shows you that setting in action. Because, like I said, a lot of people may be unfamiliar with games. They might not understand the terminology of games that we don't want to take it for granted that the terms that we're using are known by everyone. It's always best to assume that people might not know what remapping is. So this is a really nice example. And you can also see a big green tick, you know, that this is toggled on or off. So it's a really nice way to indicate that this setting is turned on, this is what it does, this is what it looks like. Similarly, another thing you can do is divide up your settings into sort of categories. So Jacob mentioned earlier with Ratchet and Clank, that they have all these different movement options. So that's a fairly common one. In the Lara Croft games as well, they do this as well, where you might have the combat be quite tricky for a person, but they really love like the puzzles, and the world navigation. They love exploring, they love solving the puzzles. It's just the fighting bit that they struggle with. So you might have combat accessibility. And again, we've got the setting. Is it toggled on or off? What does it do? Really nice and clearly explained, and gives people that customizability so that if they're finding the combat difficult, but everything else is fine, they can adjust that to themselves. Similarly, it might be the other way. So if somebody, say, a brain injury or another cognitive condition, they might be getting lost sort of in the game, or auto vault over objects, things like that, auto run, just separating them out so it's nice and clear for people what setting does what. And you can see these are all tied under a universal accessibility setting. So people know that if I go into accessibility, that's where I'm going to find the settings. And then if I'm struggling with combat, I go to combat. If I'm struggling with movement, so on and so forth. So a couple other really nice settings that we've seen, or features we've seen when it comes to your menus, is one where it actually remembers the last sort of highlighted option you were doing. Because what a lot of people will do is they want to try a setting to see if it works or not. They might toggle it off or on. It might not do the thing they thought it did, or it might not be the right thing. So having it actually highlight and return back to the setting that you've just tinkered with can be a really nice way to make that a much more comfortable experience for players, to avoid them getting confused and accidentally turning settings off and on that they didn't mean to. In the same vein, giving people sort of a safe area, like a test firing range or something like that, if your game, if that's appropriate for your game, can be a really nice way of giving players a low stakes environment where they can get themselves set up, they can try out these different settings and find a way of playing that works for them. And finally, just want to make sure, again, because we're sort of encouraging players to tinker with the settings, and we want them to do that to adjust the game for themselves, but we want to make sure they also don't sort of get stuck. So you always want to have a reset button and just double check, confirm that yes, you do want to make these changes, that sort of thing, and make sure there's always a way to reset it back to default, especially with things like remapping. If you're not sort of careful, players might sort of remap away the button they need to get back into the remapping to change it back again, especially with new gamers who might not be familiar with it. So just a nice way of making sure that players are sort of safe to tinker around with the settings as they need. Finally, just want to talk a little bit about sort of analog actions, things like that. So you're probably fairly familiar with this, but these are things like your dead zones, the sensitivity, how the joysticks behave for people. This can be really important, especially things like dead zones can be extremely helpful for people with tremors, for people with involuntary movements. For those of you who may not be familiar, a dead zone basically means you make a small circle where if I move my joystick, a couple millimeters, the game's not going to pick that up. So say if you have a small tremor, you could set that dead zone to be a little larger than normal. So you have a little more room to kind of accidentally wiggle the joystick before it's actually going to make the character move. Similarly, if you have a condition, say like motor neuron disease, where you have very weak muscles, maybe they're sort of degenerating, and you need the joystick to be very, very sensitive, you can't maybe push the joystick as far as other people naturally could. So instead, we can reduce that dead zone right down. We can maybe adjust the sensitivity of at what point, how far do we need to push the joystick before it sort of the game picks it up as being sort of maximum pushed. So we don't need to necessarily push it all the way over if that doesn't suit our body. This can also just be very helpful for players of all sorts, generally like to mess around with their sensitivities. But especially the dead zones, and thinking about when does letting players control when the action actually occurs when they're moving their joysticks can be very, very helpful. And as Jacob mentioned as well, allowing players to remap buttons to a joystick can be very helpful because that can give you four very easy to hit buttons if the joystick is comfortable for somebody. Whew, so quick breather. So that's all to do. That first section is all to do with sort of controller side things. Sorry, I'm just very aware that you're just listening to us sort of babble on. But yeah, so the first section is all to do with controllers and inputs and things you do with the physical controller. And now we're going to quickly dive into the actual gameplay. What sort of things can we change with the gameplay to make it more accessible? And really, it boils down to two kinds of things. So there's modifying the player strength, so making the player themselves stronger in some way. So a great example of this is Celeste, if anyone's played it. It's a really lovely game about climbing a mountain and sort of working through your issues. It's got a very beautiful story to it. And they offer all sorts of bonkers settings. So you can become literally invincible. You can have infinite stamina, infinite dashes. You can adjust the game speed, which is really nice as a platformer. Gives you more time to think through what you're doing and react and get your body to your buttons and switches. And again, we mentioned reasonable. And the reason these settings are reasonable for Celeste because it's a single player game. So kind of turning on invincibility and essentially God mode, you're not really bothering anyone by doing that. You're not impacting anyone else's gameplay. Whereas online, this may be a setting that is possibly unreasonable in that setting, in that situation. So there are decisions that need to be made about what's appropriate and what isn't. But with a single player game, you're not bothering anyone. And really, yes, it's a platformer, but the main essence of Celeste is experiencing the story. I think a large part of games is most people want to finish them. They want to get to the end, and that's usually more important than necessarily jumping over all the obstacles. It's actually finding out the story of Celeste. So that's why these particular settings were appropriate for Celeste. Moving on to an online game, so Super Smash Bros. You're playing against other people. I mean, you do play against bots, but a lot of people play against their friends, where having an invincibility mode is probably a little bit busted. So, but what's a way we could do? What's something reasonable you can do? Well, we can let the players decide for themselves what level of adjustment they want. So you can literally give yourself a handicap, similar to playing golf or tennis or something like that. It's very common in sports that someone might have give themselves a handicap. And it simply means you start with more damage or you take more damage. But a great way around that is, especially in sort of a couch co-op game like a Smash Bros., let the players, again, decide for themselves what they feel is reasonable for them. So you don't necessarily have to make the decision for them. You just give them the tools so that they can decide for themselves. And similarly with FIFA and EAFC, so this gives you lots of control over, again, your player character in terms of how fast they sprint and the adjustments for shot, passing and shooting and things of that nature. So you can have a lot of control over the individual elements of the game that you choose to tweak, but it will always come down to a decision of what's appropriate for your game and what you're trying to achieve. The other element, instead of making the player stronger, you can of course modify the game in some way, the actual world. So I spoke earlier about the Tomb Raider series. So this has a really nice way of doing it where you have the overall difficulty, and you've probably seen this creeping into games where you have like a story mode and it's very difficult to sort of fail, all the way up to, you die in one hit, and that's what your challenge runs sort of people do on streaming sites and things. But one really nice way of doing this is break it down into the different parts of your game. So like I said, Tomb Raider, it's about combat, it's about exploration, it's about solving puzzles. And some people may absolutely love solving the puzzles, but they really struggle with the combat. So you can set the combat to easy, the puzzles to really hard, and you can have the game, again, adapted to your needs and have a really good time. And again, you can do similar sort of things with enemies. You can give the enemies more health. You can make the world drop more ammunition, things of that nature. You can make the enemies, maybe their shots are a little less accurate, things of that nature. And a really nice setting is slow mode. So I believe this is from Jedi Survivor. This is what Celeste had as well, but this is a really nice one because it's actually contextual. So you can either map it to be a button that you trigger, and so the game's running at full speed, and then you can press the button and it will slow down. Or a really nice feature of this game is you can set it so that when it detects combat, it will then slow down. So you can enjoy the game at full pace normally. However, when it comes to the trickier combat bits, you can slow the game down to work at a pace that's more suited for you and your body. Like I mentioned, different games, different genres, you're going to have different settings. Not every setting will be appropriate for every single one. It is completely fine to not have every setting in the world. It's much better to think about what are the challenges that our game is throwing up to people, and where is the friction? What is the friction that we intend to be there? And what is maybe a small little oversight like that press start from the beginning. So in platformers, you can have things like ledge guards, you can slow down the time, you can stop fall damage, the checkpoints can be sooner, things like that. Racing, for example, as Jacob's talked about, auto steer, auto brake. The Forza series, really good for this because it really gives you a lot of control over just how much brake, how much auto brake, how much auto steer. But you're probably getting the message that actually, rather than trying to necessarily solve the problem for the player, it's usually a better approach to give the player the tools so they can solve it themselves. They can adjust it to themselves, and that way you don't have to try and mind read the 450 million people with disabilities trying to play. You simply give them the toolbox and they can adjust the game as appropriate. As mentioned, good old simplification is a really great way to make your game more accessible. And again, this can be an option if you want to. So having, say, in Red Dead, where you could set a waypoint and have it automatically go to the waypoint just to avoid having to hold the joystick, again, removing a button hold in that way. Having things so like the camera automatically will be behind the players at all times is a great way to reduce that second joystick often in a lot of games. So like Spyro and Crash Bandicoot, things like that. Just thinking about how the camera behaves, really great way to reduce that second joystick and move us from that E tier up into the Bs and the As and the S tier. And finally, I just want to touch on, so I mentioned Sea of Thieves a few times. So we did work with them on a single stick mode, which actually consisted of several different settings because there's different environments. There's like swimming, for instance, where you're underwater in an underwater 3D environment. And because of how that needed to be navigated, it meant that we actually needed to add like an auto float feature. So when you went in the water, it would automatically float you to the top, so you can just swim around on the top of the water and stop you from drowning. It has things like when you approach a hill and you start walking up a hill, the camera will automatically adjust to be at the correct angle looking up and down the hills. And it has settings like instead of turning your camera down to look at the loots, press X to loot or whatever on the floor, instead it brings those button inputs up to the middle of your screen so that you don't need to tilt the camera down to necessarily look at what you're looting. You just get the prompt at regular old eye level. And another one will just have the camera, no matter where it's moved, will just, after a few seconds, just return back to a nice neutral position. So it just, again, alleviated how much of that second joystick you need.
So what we've been talking about has all come from the Devkit that we created a special effect. So this has got a lot more detail into the different kinds of settings and categories that you can implement in your games. So if you go to specialeffectdevkit.info, it's a free to use resource. And the whole point of this is to not say you must include these in all your games. The whole point is to sort of give you the tools, and we'll leave it to you guys to figure out what you think is appropriate to put in. We're not here to advocate. We're just here to give you the information and the tools for you to do what you would like to do with it. So we've got a kind of starting point section where if you kind of touched upon the sort of genre specific settings. So these kind of categories will give you kind of deep dive into that, whether it's going to be driving or action adventure, even eye gaze. So for example, you look at something and it'll dwell automatically to select it, things like that, the adaptive controllers. I mean, there's all kinds of rabbit holes you can go down with this, but we try to make it as navigatable as possible and just kind of give you some good starting points to maybe have a think about these kind of settings. So yeah, and one of the things you can also look here is the checklist option. So again, it's something just that's optional, but it's worth just taking a look at all these videos and resources, because I think it's about an hour and a half's worth of video footage across all the categories. And it's not an exhaustive list for everything either. Obviously, there's so many things that we probably haven't touched upon. We're always looking at these new kind of original settings that are coming out as well. But this is just based on our experience as a charity for the last nearly 20 years of games. So the checklist is a good way to take a look and see whether or not you've implemented these settings, as you can see here. So obviously, it's all completely optional. So it's all down to whether you use this. It's just down to your own discretion. And we also have our gameaccess.info website as well. It's also free to use. We try to keep this updated as much as we can with videos on particular games that highlight their control schemes and their accessibility settings, but also the hardware that we use in our day-to-day work as well. So there's a wealth of information on here that'll give you breakdowns of certain games that are often accompanied with a lot of videos as well. And you can do lots of filtering as well to see if there's any kind of genres you're interested in, or any kind of hardware you might be looking into. It's always worth just to have a little search around, see what's out there, because we've been doing this website for a good number of years now. So there's quite a lot of articles on here that you might find useful. So we've also got it in so many different languages as well, as you can see here. And there's also this sort of the tag list as well, that you can just sort of drop down and show you the bits of kit, the different kinds of games that we have as well. So, for example, you type in Android, it'll still come up with all the Android videos you've got here. The search bar is pretty accurate, so it's always good to just have a little look around and see what takes your fancy. And I believe that is everything. So thank you so much, everyone, for listening to us for the last however long, 55 minutes now. It's really cool to always do talks and just to sort of give our insight into this information, just because we're really passionate about games and passionate about making sure as many people can play it as possibly can. So hopefully this has all been really useful to everyone watching. So thank you.
Thank you. Hopefully, we've got a few minutes for questions.
Yeah, tremendous. Thank you so much. It's really, really interesting stuff. Mike and Jacob, I'm conscious that my camera seems to have stopped working. I don't know if you can see me at all. So yeah, I do apologize. I suspect a little reset might be in order, but I didn't want to kick everyone off. I think there's so much to consider there. I think be interesting from your point of view. I mean, in terms of the sort of obviously integrating some of these action points, I suppose sort of the earlier the better, and perhaps it's also going to be a case of rather than this being an afterthought, it might even provide some greater insight into your development, certain aspects of your development cycle, basically. Sort of when considering some of these things, might unlock some new ideas for gameplay anyway. So yeah, really, really interesting stuff. And I think certainly highlighting the sort of deeper levels of control customization, like you've mentioned, but also some of those things were just going to be really helpful for everyone involved, like the sort of backtracking on settings, and rather than sort of soft locking yourself out of the game entirely. We haven't had. We've got one question here in terms of the controllers side of things. So we've got a question on how accessible is the PlayStation Access controller? Is it vastly different from the Xbox adaptive controller, or are they quite similar?
There is significant difference. Sony decided to do a different input, or different way of controlling their controller, in that it comes built in with the buttons and a joystick already, whereas with the adaptive controller and the HoriFlex for the Nintendo Switch, you have to purchase your own peripherals to plug into it. I would say in terms of how accessible it is incredibly subjective, because it's not going to be a one size fits all. There's going to be the access controller might work for loads of people. It's not going to work for other people who might find the adaptive controller for the Xbox better, for example. There's caveats and there's pros and cons to each of these. I think with the accessibility with the access controller for the PS5, it's not just the hardware that you've got with the joystick and built-in buttons. It's also the software that PlayStation have included as well, because you can make any of the built-in buttons become a toggle option, where you don't have to rely on the game having that option to toggle on a particular button. You can just sort of do it within the system settings on the access controller, which is a really cool feature, really, really useful. So games that you might want to accelerate in without holding down, you can just tap it instead to do that. It's also got the option to bind two inputs to a single button as well. So, if you want to do like in God of War, you got rage mode where you have to use both the stick clicks or cross and circle. You can instead map those to a single button instead. And it's great for a lot of people when all the buttons are sort of closed in and built in. Whereas with the XAC or the Xbox Adaptive Controller, you do have that flexibility of positioning the buttons wherever you need to. And whilst the Access controller has got 4 switch ports, the adaptive controller's got a port for every single button for the controller. And that's been really good to allow us to customize setups where people might need switches by their head, by their feet, elbows, for example. You saw Suzanne earlier. She's got so many bits of kit and peripherals around her because of the access of the XAC, the adaptive controller for the Xbox, whereas the PS5 access controller might not have been the way forward for that. But that's why we do what we do, because it's not a one size fits all. Every single person we see is completely customized based on the games they want to play, based on their physical circumstances, the console that they're on. So it's great that both these controls are out there, because it just means we have the option to use either of them depending on the person. Unless there's anything else you want to add to that?
No, I think you covered it very well.
Cool.
Fantastic. No, thank you very much. That's really, really helpful. I don't know if you can see the chat, but we've had another question about the Switch controllers with the audio jack style inputs. Comment that must be quite expensive buying the converters back to USB. Is this something that you've encountered at all? Or?
We have done. It's more for the joysticks really that we find, because we work with a lot of third-party suppliers who we buy our joysticks from, and some of them might have the 3.5mm jack joysticks, some of them might have the USB ports. With the access controller for the PS5, there's only 4 3.5 jacks on it. So when it comes to joysticks, it's only limited to the 3.5 input joysticks, whereas on the adaptive controller for the Xbox, you've got USB ports as well. So there is more, I think, more tech coming out where you can kind of choose between the 3.5 jack or the USB. But it does depend on the joysticks that we use. We like a lot of the large joysticks that we use are mostly the USB style that can sort of plug into the adaptive controller for the Xbox and for the Hurry Flex, whereas the sort of smaller joysticks that are a bit more compact will more often than not have the 2.5mm jack. I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask why that is the case, because I'm less about sort of nerdy hardware side of things, unless you've got some kind of idea.
No, I mean, well, it's traditionally a fairly cheap way to you can stick a 3.5mm jack on quite a few things. If that is something that sort of interests you, there's a colleague of ours called Barry Ellis from One Switch. I don't know if you're familiar with One Switch. Seeing some love in the chat for Barry Ellis. He's been doing. We literally before this call, he gave us a presentation going back from like the 70s on the evolution of this technology and how it came about. And he does a lot of the sort of modification of controllers when we need things sort of lightened, if we need certain switches and joysticks modified. There's another chap called Graham from a company called Celtic Magic, if you're familiar with them. But if you really like to geek out about the specifics of like the electronics behind it all, they'd be two really great people to reach out to, because that's what they do. That's like bread and butter for them.
And just to address the other question as well about whether the switches are responsive. Yes, they are. We're finding there's loads of other switches coming out now, like from Logitech. They've released the Logitech Adaptive Gaming Kit. There's one for the adaptive controller for the Xbox, and it's one for the Axis controller, and both of them have, I think it's 12 switches for the Xbox version and 8 for the Axis controller. And they're really good to use, really cost effective as well. So we find that all the switches that we use, whether it's a buddy button, a spec switch, ultralight HD switch, or the Logitech buttons, we find that they're really good to use with all the controllers that we use.
Reliable too.
Yeah.
They can take a beating, which is important when you've got young kids with cerebral palsy and things like that.
Yeah.
So they're very sturdy. They've lasted a very long time. Like we said, we provide a lifelong service, and so people have our equipment for years and years and years, and it's relatively rare that the sort of buttons and things break. Someone mentioned joystick drift earlier in the chat. That's a more common feature than those sort of 3.5mm jacks sort of giving out on us. So yeah, it's very reliable. Good way of doing it.
Well, thank you so much, both of you. It's been really, really fascinating listening to this. I think there's an awful lot for people to consider here, and so many reasons for them to do so ultimately. So yeah, thank you so much for your time. Apologies again for my camera disappearing. I am here and have been all along. So yeah, we should draw this to a close, and your contact details are going to be on the recording and everything, the info address, and I'll make sure those extra resources are linked to as well. It'd be fantastic. All right.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, cheers everyone.
Cheers. Have a good day.